All right, so take it away, Matt.
Great, thanks, Glennis. So first of all, I wanted to start just by welcoming everyone. This is our first physics department colloquium of the year. And more importantly, it's our inaugural Dr Adler colloquium. So that's a series that I'll introduce now, just briefly before Glennis introduces our speaker today. So, so again, thanks for coming and welcome. So Dr Adler was a professor in our department who unexpectedly and suddenly passed away last spring. And he was someone that was dear to all of us. He was an absolutely superb pedagogue and teacher. He was widely recognized as such. And I'll come briefly to read a few memories of him that people wrote, and it's just a small sample of the huge number we have. But he was also recognized by the institution. There's about, I think, more than 1,100 faculty in NYU's College of Arts and Sciences. And every year there's an award called the Golden Dozen that's given to 12 of the best teachers. And Andre won that award twice in the last 15 years. So that just goes to show how widely recognized his skills at teaching really were. And beyond just being an incredibly clear teacher, he was a wonderful human being. He was extremely kind. And I really think there's nothing that he cared about more than physics education. So in his memory, we established this colloquium series, and it's going to be annual. So this is the inaugural one. But from now on, we'll have one talk per year, one Dr Adler colloquium per year. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen just to show you a slideshow. Sorry. For some reason, let's see. Okay, are you seeing the slideshow? There should be a picture of Andre.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to just adjust this so that it plays automatically. And okay, so these are just a series of photographs of Andre that were taken by members of our department and others. This will just cycle through. And meanwhile, I'm going to read a few memories of him. If you would like to see more of these memorials to him, if you navigate just to our physics website and to the faculty page, then look down at the bottom, you'll find all of them. So here's one from Burton Budick. The news, these were written shortly after he passed away. The news about Andre's passing is the saddest, most devastating imaginable. His kindness knew no bounds. The department is impoverished without him. And then that is indeed extremely sad news. Andre was a wonderful person and a tireless advocate for physics and exciting the next generation with its wonders. That's from Paul Chaikin, faculty member here. It was always a joy working with Andre. He inspired an open mind and encouraged our work and kids who might benefit from a little science. That's from Andrew Cribb, a photographer that worked with Andre on his outreach efforts. And from a student, Basil Alfecki, just wanted to say something about Dr. Adler. Dr. Adler was one of the nicest and most caring people I have met. He truly cared about each of his students. Never seen somebody with such a passion for teaching students and seeing them learn. He was really one of the best teachers in our department. He will truly be missed by us all. So I'll pause there. But again, if you would like to read these memorials to Andre, just go to our physics page and look for faculty and search for his name or look down near the bottom. Okay, so with that said, Glennis, why don't you take over and introduce our speaker?
Well, I have so much emotion right now, and so really grateful that Carl immediately accepted when last winter I extended the invitation. And it's sort of especially poignant for me because Carl is the second colloquium Carl has given. Actually, 15 years ago, he spoke about the research that they were doing at the University of Colorado, which was, relatively speaking, in its infancy, although he'd already been at it 5 or 10 years, and they developed wonderful, what I remember the most vividly as tools for students to do simulations and so on to make physics more vivid. And Andre and I both loved it, and we spoke so much. We spoke so much afterwards about it. And then in the course of time, we were both using it and talking to each other about it and say, oh, don't miss this one, and so on. Anyway, so there's a special thank you for that reason. Well, okay, I'll launch into the introduction. And I'm going to keep it short, but I have to just say that I am thinking about this and preparing it. I have to say that I think Carl is probably the person who's accomplished more and thinks more deeply than anyone I personally know. And when you think about his accomplishments in physics, they're remarkable. I first became aware of him or knew of him in his work in pioneering the search for parity violation in atoms, which is very complementary to all of the previous work had been just in accelerators. And so with a very arduous effort to do that, now for many years, the experiment has been far ahead of theory. Theory is starting to catch up, which can make it sort of back in the game to compete with things like the LHC. And sort of as the kind of person he is, he started inventing how to make atoms cold efficiently. And then that led, he had the astuteness to hire Eric Cornell as his postdoc. And then together they developed this work that discovered or demonstrated boson-Hines condensation. It's pretty much contemporaneously with Ketterle's doing that. And the diversity of things he would tackle and the originality of how he would tackle it is only even further demonstrated by the fact of his moving into research about education. Because what could be more diverse and impactful than that? Anyway, I will make available for people a list of some interesting articles he's written and so on that I very highly recommend. And I especially recommend to all the students who are listening that they read about his various periods of tribulation and take heart from the things that were going badly and not working and so on, and a lot of hard work and so on. Anyway, I won't speak about it anymore, except to remind everyone, if they don't know, that Carl has very generously agreed to meet with us all as a department tomorrow from 1 to up to 2:30, depending on how much conversation there is, to talk about implementation of the things he's going to talk about today and really go into things in greater depth. So at the end, we'll have some questions regarding today's talk and be thinking about bigger things you want to, or other things you want to talk about tomorrow, and you can either send me an email or put it in the chat and so on. So Carl, please take it away. Thank you again for coming.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great, Matt. I need to share my screen here. And let me first say it's an honor to be giving the first these Adler colloquiums, and nice to be talking to NYU again. It doesn't seem like it's as long as Glenna says, but we're all aging, I guess. But I'm going to talk about really taking a scientific approach to physics education. And I'll actually make the argument that, as you'll see, that my work is not that diverse. I've really approached education in much the same spirit, actually, that I approach my physics research. But so the talk will be organized in the, first I want to sort of give you the bigger picture of kind of the educational goals and interest and some basic principles about learning that have been established that are relevant to this. And then I'll go into more detail about applying these in university courses and measuring the results, particularly from physics. And then I'll finish up with some basic principles and practices of research shows improve learning. And as I'll go over, really improve learning specifically about how to help people think more like scientists, specifically more like physicists in their lives and jobs. Now, before I go into that, though, I'll just give a little background of how I got into this area so you can understand my really perspective thinking about the subject. And it actually started really with my physics research. And I saw this pattern that the students would come into my research lab, to, graduate students, and they'd had many years of great success in their coursework, but they really were fairly clueless about how to do physics. But it clearly wasn't anything fundamentally defective about them, because after a couple of years working in the lab, they turned into physicists. And so when I first started seeing this happening, I thought it was just a peculiarity of individuals. But then I saw, no, this was a pretty consistent pattern. And it made me, I think this slide's out of date. It was at least 35 years ago now, that it made me recognize there was really a fundamental question here. And I saw it as a scientific question. And so I pursued it like a science, problem of looking in depth at the research on how people learn, particularly how people learn physics, to try and see if I could understand this. And after a few years, I found, yes, reading the research literature and talking to people, I understood the explanation. This made some sense, but it also made me realize there were much more effective ways to teach than what we were using. And finally, it really got me started in doing science education research, first physics, but then more broadly, doing experiments, collecting data, and from that deriving, basic principles that one could apply more generally. And so, a whole lot like doing physics. And in fact, for, almost 30 years, I had two parallel research groups, one which was blasting atoms with lasers, and the others was studying how students could learn physics and better ways to teach it to them. But in this, in the learning that I've been focused on, it really still goes back to the original question with the graduates, and it's really, what's involved in what I would call expertise, but really mean thinking like a good physicist and solving problems like a good physicist does, and how do we teach that, and how do people learn that? Now, in the past few decades, there's actually been pretty major advances in understanding how to teach this kind of complex thinking. And it comes from the combination of cognitive psychologists looking at basic process of how the brain thinks and learns, some most recently from brain research, and then a lot from the kind of things that I and people like me do of really doing experiments, getting data in university science and engineering classrooms. And before I get into any details on this, I want to sort of tell you how it's really, this research collectively has really given us a new paradigm for how this kind of thinking of expertise really happens. And the old and I'll claim incorrect model, but still quite prevalent in our education systems, particularly universities, are that we have these student brains and they vary in different ways and they come into our classrooms and we then immerse them in knowledge, and that soaks into different amounts depending on the conditions of those brains. And when this is the view of learning, then the natural focus, and you can see that in our university system, is you focus mostly on how can we select the best brains that's going to soak in the best, and what do we put in that knowledge soup, that that's the curriculum, what topics in which order and so on to be most effective. So that's the old view. Now the new view that research gives us is really that these brains start out not actually all that different when they first come into our institutions, but those brains change. They're actually transformed through the educational process. And it's actually rewiring how the neurons are connected. and in response to intense thinking. And it's that rewired brain that actually has these improved capabilities that that the learning represents. Now, we can actually even see this nowadays. Well, researchers can see this in brain images. This is an image here of two people in an MRI machine interpreting a medical X-ray image. And on the right, you have a medical student who's just first learning how to do this. And on the left is an expert radiologist doing many years of training at this. And you can see how their brains are actually activated and working in very different ways as a result of this expert training. And the more detailed studies can actually see the progression of these changes as people are learned. Now, so what this tells us is that the really critical things in learning are enhancing the right kind of neuron connections to build these capabilities. And it's really very much like muscle development. And so one needs just as to develop a muscle, you need the right kind of practice and for high intensity and prolonged ways, we see it's very much the same in with the brain. It needs to be the right kind of mental practice. It's got to be high intensity, and it's got to go on for a long period of time. And the rest of my talk is really then getting into more detail about different ways you do to enhance the intensity, but more importantly, how to get the right type of mental exercise and what's more and which different ways are more effective. So there's been lots of work developing, trying different things out in university courses and measuring results. And I'll just give you some quick examples of that. But the most of the university physics classroom research is kind of in this standard form, is that you think of some particular test that probes some aspect of how well the students are learning to think like or make decisions like an expert physicist would in a particular context and sort of appropriate situation. And then you compare how well they do on that test for different kinds of teaching methods, where the most of the time the standard is kind of the traditional lecture teaching. And then you have various different kinds of teaching approaches. They have different names. You may pure instruction and active learning and the whole bunch of other series of acronyms and jargon. But ultimately, the ones that show significant effects almost always focus or involve the students rather than just listening in class. They actually are doing things where they're having to practice making decisions in some carefully designed scenarios, and they're getting feedback on those decisions. And that's much of a class time's taken up with this practice and feedback. So I'll give you an example, a couple of examples of actually this sort of work. This things I've been involved in, but other people are doing very similar work. And so this is looking at learning in a large introductory physics class. And it was so big, we could get two different sections where the distribution measured the students to be very nearly identical. And so we could teach these two sections in two different ways. The control was some highly experienced professor who had good student ratings, but used a standard lecture approach. He was also very, I guess you have to say, really arrogant. He was sure his students were learning a lot more than what we claimed. And so he was determined to prove it to us. And then the experimental approach class was taught by somebody who was a fairly new physics PhD, but trained in my program on these principles and methods that I'll show you and tell you more about on this research-based teaching. And so in both of these but these two instructors then agreed to cover the same material and the same amount of class time. And then they tested how well the students learned in a surprise test that came to start of the next class. So this is really focusing on what they were learning from coming to class and carefully separated from homework and exams and so on. So in the experimental class, the sorts of things that happen is, or what happened in all of them is they had a short pre-class reading assignment to prepare them. And this didn't really teach them the physics, but it gave them basic facts and terminology that they didn't need to waste class time on. And then class was devoted to answering questions. And here's an example of a question that posed to the students. They've got this battery and light bulbs, and they're asked, when that switch is closed, what's going to happen to the brightness of bulb number 2 here? Now, every student, use some electronics here, every student has to answer. This time it was done with clickers. Now people replace this with using just mobile phones to answer. But basically, each student has to answer, and the computer records who they were and what they answered. And then the instructor has a monitor there of showing what the answers are. And then the students aren't told the answer. They're instead told they have to talk with their neighbors in a big lecture theater like this. It's just the nearest kind of each side of them about what the answer is and why, and then they go ahead and re-vote. Now, but while they're having those discussions, the instructor is circulating around up and down the aisles, listening in on those conversations and getting a sense of then the student thinking, what's like a physicist and where are they confused. Then after the second vote, they're done the demonstration, show them the result. But then there's a follow-up summary by the instructor where it gives targeted feedback to them on which models and thinking that they're picked up that they're using were correct and which were incorrect and why. And I emphasize the incorrect and why here because this is something that the cognitive psychologists have shown very clearly that doing something correct, you don't really learn much from. It's when you're doing something wrong and then you understand not just what you did that was wrong, but why, and so how to change. That's where learning really takes place. And I emphasize this because I see oftentimes instructors using these methods, but they still go and the feedback to the students is just to tell them what the right answer is and not help them understand what they did incorrectly. And so this going over why the incorrect answers are wrong is actually is much more important than telling them just what the correct answer is. Anyway, okay, so that's what happens here. And I just stress, in this process, you think how students are practicing thinking like physicists. And, they're given a problem, they have to think, develop a conceptual model of how electricity works in this case, how it works with the light bulbs, have to apply that, make predictions with it, and critique their own and other people's reasoning during that process. And so, so you can see this is basically exercising the physicist's thinking and the brains, and that's really the critical aspect of learning. And while they're doing it, they're getting feedback, which is another really critical aspect of learning on their thinking and so how to get it better. And they're getting it from other students, but they're also, more importantly, getting it from the instructor, who's much more informed than they could ever be if they're just giving a lecture, much more informed about how the students are thinking. So, okay, that's a big buildup. How do they do on this quiz in the comparison between the traditional lecture and this research-based teaching here? So this is the histogram of the scores on this test for the two different sections. And you can see there's a big difference between the two. The difference is actually probably bigger than you realize, because on this particular test, random guessing would give a student a score of 3 on average. And so the amount of learning you really have to think is how far above 3 they are. And when you look at it that way, you realize that the same as I could show you other data showing this, is that the learning from the lecture was just really tiny. And also, want to emphasize, this shows that this kind of research-based teaching isn't just most effective for the best students or the weakest students. It's really, you can see the entire distribution moves up here. It's really most effective for every student with a human brain, because this is the way the human brain learns. Now, most of the research in this field has actually been done in introductory courses, but my group has over the last dozen years focused more on applying these ideas in more advanced courses and how do you implement them. We have this article here gives a very detailed about the design and implementation. It's for a 4th year optics course, but the particular topics of the course aren't important. We kind of gave general idea of working in more advanced physics courses, how you would structure this kind of research-based teaching. And so at Stanford now, we have, I think it's 8 courses in the physics major sequence through now, so most of them have actually gone through this kind of transformation process. And we even have where it's been extended to graduate courses, quantum field theory even. And it basically shows it works well. And all of these are much smaller classes, of course, and much more mathematical. So, but you still have the same idea here that students are working in small groups. They're working, in this case, worksheets. So there's lots more mathematics involved. And the instructor is circulating around, monitoring how they're doing. And so the basic structure that people have found works very well for this kind of, in almost any course in any level, is that the students do some modest preparation ahead of class, and the instructor develops this sort of set of practice activities that they're going to go through and emphasize these involve making decisions. And then the students work during class. They're working through on these activities in small groups, being monitored by the instructor. And then typically every 10 to 15 minutes, then the instructor will pull the whole class together and answer questions and give feedback to them and sort of bring everybody in the class up onto this, similar common level and clear up confusion, and then go ahead and then the students go back to continuing working through this process, through the exercise. And the essential features are the students are practicing the expert reasoning, that the physics reasoning and problem solving that you want to be doing, and the instructor is monitoring that thinking and giving them more targeted feedback. And also, just as a side note, everybody who ends up doing this fully implemented, the instructors greatly prefer it. So there's been something like 1,000 studies across science and engineering universities, all different levels, looking at this, and they show consistently greater learning and lower failure and dropout rates. Now, but almost all of that work has been looking at just kind of an average and the whole how the distribution shifts up. More recently, my group has been tackling, and others have started to tackling about the issue of not just moving the distribution up, but taking this whole part of the compressing the distribution. So, I'm worrying about how do we take these students in here and move them up so they're all piled up at being highly successful. And I have to admit, I gotten more interested in this since I've been at Stanford, because I'd been at public universities and so on. You got a big range of populations of students and so on. But at Stanford, I knew that every single student there has been very carefully selected, and so it just didn't make sense to me to see these students who, by the measures of what I'd seen in other institutions, being really, were superb, why they were still down here doing poorly in these introductory, or some of them doing poorly in these introductory courses. And so, we studied about whether it's just the teaching methods and putting those in effect, and no, you can move the distribution up, but you still had the broad distribution. And so we've been studying other factors in the last couple of years that are important, that involves getting data on a whole bunch of different things about the students and doing fancy statistical analysis, multiple regression, etc. And to look at what matters. And so I'm going to start by looking at a couple of things that most people in Stanford thought were what mattered. And first, what math these students had taken, and we found no, in the first semester physics class, that's just not a relevant thing. Then there's a question of whether it involved demographics and possible social, psychological things there. And that the reason people thought that was a big factor was that if you look at Stanford, and frankly, it's the same at every institution I know of that's looked at this, and that's quite a few, is you see that, okay, historically underrepresented minorities, this is grades here, they do worse. First generation students do worse than the alternatives, and females score lower than males. And so the prevailing view was, well, these are probably important in why students aren't doing so well. But we dug into this more, and we looked at different measures of preparation, and the only two that mattered were math, SAT scores, or general math as a measure of general math science preparation, and physics specific preparation that we measured with one of these concept tests, the force motion concept evaluation. When you took into account these measures of prior preparation, which they're pretty crude measures after all, but in fact, these gaps all went away. And so what that told us is that these demographic gaps, they aren't really anything to do with the demographics, that the gaps are all in the preparation. There's just correlations between the quality of student preparation in physics that are correlated with these demographic variables. But the real bottom line is that incoming preparation was a very powerful predictor of their outcomes in these introductory courses. And it's a powerful predictor for all students, regardless of background and color, gender, etc. Now, how important is this dependence of grades on prior preparation? Well, if you look more generally, and just makes sense that, how you do in your introductory physics is really critical to going on to success as a physics major or as an engineering major, as that these courses are required for almost all the engineering schools. And so if you do a failure analysis, which says, okay, how well can you predict by prior preparation the chances of a student succeed, getting a acceptable passing grade or a failing grade in these courses, it's really profound. If you just take the predictors that we have, which initially those two explained about 30% of the variation. What that shows is that by those measures, a student who was in the bottom 25% of preparation has quite a high probability of failing, and much, much higher than the students who come in well prepared. But these two measures, these were just the data we had, and others have. They're relatively crude measures. We, on the basis of what we learned from this, created a diagnostic test that was more targeted, had for other things in it. And this is a test which now takes students about 30 minutes to do, or a bit less. But on the basis of it, we can explain about half the variation of the full distribution of student grades, and most of the failures. Basically, we can say ahead of time, oh, this student's going to succeed and these two students are going to fail, just on the basis, they take this quick little test. Doesn't matter that they go through a whole the whole term of studying and doing homework and so on. So now, if this was just Stanford, you think, well, that's really kind of peculiar. But where it really gets important and relevant to your institution and others is that we ran the same analysis we got the data collaboration with Colorado and Cornell, and we saw very similar dependencies on student outcomes according to their preparation. And I mean, it's really striking to compare Colorado and Stanford, because Colorado is not exactly open enrollment, but it's very little selectivity compared to Stanford that's selecting from the very top. And yet exactly the same measures, even though the two distributions are scoring very differently, those measures do exactly as well and very, very powerful at predicting who's going to succeed and who's going to fail. So what this says is that it's really the nature of teaching, not the nature of the students. And maybe other institutions are different, but I'd be quite surprised. And I bet that if you run the analysis at your institution, you're going to see something that looks a lot the same. And what I think is the explanation has to be that kind of implicitly and without intentionally thinking about this, that the way instructors are teaching is they really optimize the coverage and pace for the top half of best prepared students. And so the ones who come in with very weak preparation just cannot do well there. They're just too far behind from the beginning, even with the best kinds of teaching methods. And I think fundamentally this goes back to the original wrong paradigm of learning, and the fact that people are mixing up idea of brains are different, some are more talented than others, with the reality, which is just how much educational privilege different students have had. And so by teaching in this way, we're really amplifying, we being everybody who's teaching introductory physics, or at least in many cases. And I can certainly make this claim about Stanford, where I know in detail the population and teaching, is really amplifying the discrimination that's present in the US K-12 education system. Discrimination that's fundamentally about the wealth of your school district, but that carries its correlated with race and first generation, just because of the economics of our country. And we dug into this more, looking at across the Stanford student population, and I mean, what we see, and I think others see similar things, is that if you look in the low income school districts, the high school physics courses, even though they have APNs on, they're just really badly taught. And so the students come out of those courses much less prepared, and that carries over to their lack of success in introductory classes. Okay, so I'm going to now jump to more happy topic of looking at principles and practices that come out of this research of things you can apply directly, all the summary of everything we've learned about what the research is important for learning to think like a physicist. And the core is really this idea of practicing making decisions, at the problem-solving decisions like a physicist does, and getting good feedback to help improve those it's got to be timely and specific and actionable. But there's a lot of things that have to go into the design of those activities, and that's up at the top here to make them optimally effective. And there's things that research tells us about what has to go into the implementation to be effective. And I would argue that this diagram in sum, it really defines teaching expertise in a way that we couldn't have done even 10 years ago, in that it really establishes clear practices that research shows produce better learning in the same way we have medical practices that we now know, okay, treated this way, their patient's going to recover better than if they are done in a different way. And I'll say, this is really the details of design and implementation, which I'm happy to, the session tomorrow, be going into much more, or I will go into what depth on any of these that people particularly want to know about. But here I'm just going to touch on some of them to give you a sense of what belongs in this. First, the disciplinary expertise. You got to have them practicing making the decisions that a problem solver in physics makes using the approaches that a physicist would. And so this is something that my group has been studying the last few years, looking at how experts across science and engineering solve really authentic problems in their field. And this always involves, we've identified making a specific set of decisions with limited information. And what was really surprising to us was to find out that it's the same set of 29 decisions that really guide the whole problem-solving approach across the many different fields of science and engineering that we've looked at on this. And that may seem kind of crazy to you at first, but if I start listing them, I think you'll understand why this could be true. I mean, there's first taking the problem, and I'll just take a set of the 29, but things like deciding what concepts and mental models are relevant to that problem, deciding what information is relevant and what's irrelevant and what information is needed to solve, deciding what approximations or simplifications are appropriate, deciding on potential solution methods to pursue, and so on through the list until you get to the end and deciding how to test if the solution or conclusion makes sense. So, I think any scientist looks in these and sort of thinks about problems they've solved in their work, and they say, oh, sure, that I've done all those, along with the other 25 here that I don't, or 4 that I don't list. Now, although I want to emphasize, although the decisions are the same in different fields, how those decisions, the making of those decisions is quite discipline specific. They always involve, every single one of them involves calling upon specialized disciplinary knowledge. And a really key aspect of being a good scientific problem solver is recognizing what information is relevant to making the decision in question. So if you look at this set of decisions, I'll emphasize that these, So learning to be a good physicist requires practicing making these decisions in authentic problem contexts. And it's this practice and feedback and making these decisions which really create, give the brain the right kind of exercise that it has these capabilities. Now, but if you look at these sorts of decisions here, and then you look at a typical textbook and you look at the problems, homework problems or test problems given, they don't have any of these decisions present. The information that's all the information they need is given, and no other information is, they're told specifically what approximations to use and so on. And so a student can go through and do all of these homework, all the problems in the textbook, and not know how to solve physics problems, not know how to do physics at all, because they never had the right kind of practice. And getting back to my original point about my graduate students in my lab, this is basically the explanation, that they've covered physics topics, they've learned physics knowledge, they've never learned how to use that knowledge, how to apply it to solve problems. But we now know how to teach them so that they can do that much better by just having them do that practicing. Okay, so that's the disciplinary expertise that has to go into this in terms of the problem and decisions they have to be making. They also, that has to be connected with appropriately with students' prior knowledge and experience level, motivation, so that they're interested in making the intense mental effort that's really important for learning, are all critical. I'm not going to take time to talk about those because I think most people understand them. I'm going to say briefly something about the brain constraints here, because this is something that's well studied and understood, but not known by most faculty and university faculty. And there's a couple of important ones. One I'm not going to talk about is how to get long-term recall. I'm going to talk about one that involves the basic initial learning process and the way remembering things works. And it turns out that you have the simplified but moderately accurate model of how memory works is, first, there's the long-term memory here. And that's what what most people think of as memory, is what cognitive psychologists would call long-term memory. This has this very large capacity, and it can remember things for very long periods, years, decades, etc. But it turns out there's another part of memory, which is called the short-term working memory. And this is basically a buffer that information has to go through to get into the long-term memory. And this working memory, in contrast to long-term, it has tiny capacity. The human brain, on average, can hold about 6 items in the working memory. And it's really the amount of stuff the brain can pay attention to at the same time. And it functions over a time scale of minutes rather than years. And so this is really critical to what happens kind of during a classroom session, because of this tiny capacity, it means that any new information that comes in, the eye sees something, it pushes something out of the working memory, and that never gets it never gets processed and into long-term memory. And so anything that's irrelevant to the learning you care about, that's getting people's attention, is actually hurting their learning because of this working memory effect. And so, you have to think then about all the additional things that can come in a classroom that's going to fill up working memory and therefore reduce the process and learning of the physics that you want the students to master. And so the first and gigantic thing is split attention. And of course, anybody who knows, the modern world knows that people are splitting their attention all the time. Students in the classroom are splitting their attention. And I recommend, if you don't believe this, go to the back of some big lecture hall and look at how many students are actually looking at their phones, checking on their computers and things like that during the class. And you'll see that during a standard lecture, it's a very large fraction. But because of the split attention, it's basically filling up the working memory with all kinds of, what they're seeing on their Facebook page. And that's just a disaster for learning. And people always underestimate how big a disaster it is in this kind of multitasking, split attention environment. So anything you can do that prevents students from splitting their attention is going to make an immediate big impact on their learning. But also, you have to think about the things you can do that are going to reduce the unnecessary demands on this working memory. And it turns out, of course, using unfamiliar jargon, putting some nice picture in there that gets their attention because it's a really attractive thing. The fact it gets their attention is really distracting from the key elements that you want in there. And it turns out, and this is the thing that gets the most outrage from students and instructors, is that great joke that everybody thought was so funny, that actually is going to hurt your learning or hurt the students' learning. And the students say, well, gee, but that's the only time I was paying attention in class. And the instructors say, gee, when I made the jokes, that's the only time students pay attention to me. And that is exactly the point, that if you realize you've got this working memory and very limited attention that it can devote to, if it's devoting that to that joke, it means that it's not devoting it to the learning of physics. Now, if that joke really involves the physics you want to learn, then it's great. But otherwise, it actually, and there's pretty good studies of this, show it's going to hurt. Okay, let me just quickly finish up saying a little bit about what things that are important about implementation here that aren't so obvious sometimes is you need to have good tasks that students are working on. But what we've seen is that to make those effective, they really have to have quite clear deliverables that the students have to actually have to produce during class that they have to do and the instructor can actually see. And then from a practical standpoint, this is the most, teaching this way is most effective if you take advantage of the social learning, having the students work together in groups, and the optimum group size is 3 to 4 students on these tasks. And you can, people can sort of understand something about why that might be useful, but a lot of times instructors will have trouble understanding how talking to a fellow student is actually better for their learning than hearing the expert teacher actually explain the subject. And one big reason for that is actually and this is again a kind of fascinating cognitive psychology result, which is that people learn better people actually bring in a different kind of cognitive processing when they're teaching or explaining something to others. And it's just our brains are wired this way because of the social interactions that actually think about the subject differently and therefore learn it in a way that you don't if you just are thinking about it and studying it on your own. And like I say, it's kind of a remarkable result, but it is quite well documented now. And plus, of course, it's very useful for the instructor to listen in on those conversations because you can understand better what the students are thinking, and you can give them this more targeted, useful feedback that to improve their learning. Okay, so I'll just wrap up here. There's some time for questions. I'll emphasize it. So, at this point, we have research that really shows good teaching design and implementation, and that this can give much better learning than a traditional lecture. And we understand at a fairly deep level why it does this in terms of what happens in the brain. But I'll start out with posing a question that many of you may be asking. I know I get asked almost always with this talk. So I'll start out with the question of, how can traditional lectures be as bad as I'm claiming here? Because look at all us university professors who were taught that way, and how successful we are. And my answer to that is that, in fact, that it's exactly the same justification and reasoning that was used to justify bloodletting as what's literally the treatment of choice for about 2,000 years. And it's only when you start doing things scientifically, with doing careful comparison groups, that you can say, no, this really, there really are better ways to do it. It's, and individually in the absolute, it's not, it's not correct, because lots of people do get well if they have bloodletting. Lots of people do learn things if they're taught ineffectively, but the brain's kind of programmed to do that. But if they're taught well, they will learn better, and many more students can be successful in physics. So with that, I'll stop. As I say, these slides will be available. Implementing any particular practices and understanding details about them, I'll go into that tomorrow as people want. Here's some of references, my favorite references on learning more about this, the general ideas in these books, and then this has a lot of sort of 2-page guides to implementing particular methods. So that, I guess, I'll stop, answer questions. People raise their hand, and I guess I'll call on you in the order. The first person here is just labeled Hog. I don't know.
Hi, it's yeah. That was great, and this research has really changed teaching. And your colloquium. My name's David Hogg, by the way. I'm here at NYU, and the colloquium you gave 15 years ago really changed the way I teach in the classroom. Also, with the help of Sanjoy Mahajan, who you may know, who's also helped me a lot with sort of turning the classroom around and getting the students to work together. It's really, I really appreciate it. One question I have, which, if I think about, and maybe this is a very different category, but I want to rephrase the question you asked at the end, like all these physicists learned this way, how could it be wrong, whatever. If I think about moments in my life where I've really learned a lot, some of them have been in very traditional environments. And in fact, this seminar that you just gave, you gave in a completely traditional way. You presented information to us with PowerPoint, and we learned things from it, and it will probably change our behavior. What's the difference between the student learning that you're talking about and the learning that you're expecting kind of us to do in the seminar that you've just given?
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple different aspects here. I mean, first, I look at this is more a sermon than a learning lecture, if you like. That's why I give you a bunch of references and I make my slides available, because I don't really think people can learn. They can learn some, and I'll explain why, but mostly they learn hopefully by thinking about what I said and going back and digging into this more and spending more time. And so I'm kind of trying to inspire people to learn and make them aware of what is out there to be learned. Now, at the same time, there is some learning that I think is being accomplished here. And that there's a really important difference here is that learning is taking place for people who are already, to a large extent, experts. They've been teaching a lot. They've thought about these things. They're aware of students and interactions. And this is and I meant a very limited extent, but some is handing them new tools that they already have, the expert knowledge structure to understand and just apply those. And so it's serving for admittedly a limited population, much the same as when you go to a conference and you hear somebody talking about doing research in your field, and they've done some things closely related with you, but they've got some new technique or the new result that they're interpreting. Okay, you can learn from that, but it's because you have a whole bunch of let's say expert wiring that you can incorporate this new information into, and therefore is much more effective for learning. So that's the answer to your question. Is that if nobody's done university teaching basically of science, I can guarantee you they'll get very little out of this, except for maybe we should go learn something about it. That's the sermon part.
I mean, I like that answer because, I mean, in some ways it plays into the bigger narrative about kind of like privileged students and well-prepared students. Is that in some sense your audience here is privileged students because we're already very prepared to learn this.
Yeah, but you also have to think about this kind of the expert brain. You already have pretty expert-like brains in thinking about physics and in thinking about learning and teaching physics. And I'm maybe just giving you some useful tools. So Mark Williamson, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, thank you. That was an amazing talk. I was curious about the diagnostic that your group came up with to measure students' incoming preparation.
Yeah.
And so since you have this diagnostic, which explains the variance so well, have you looked into like courses dedicated to filling in the gaps for those students that are less prepared? And like how quickly can you kind of catch those students up to speed, given that they're kind of been systematically underprepared for the entire K to 12?
So that's that's a really good question, and we're trying to figure out the answer to it right now. Literally right now. We've tried. So we ran one iteration of a course that we thought was particularly targeting this, and it didn't show as much impact as we'd hoped, and we don't understand why. We have some theories, but but the quick answer is we're working on it. We don't know how long it will take and really, exactly the best way to do it. So great question. I wish I knew the answer, and we're trying to find it. Aditya. Oh, sorry,
Hi.
Kyle.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm happy to have Aditya go first.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks. So thanks for the talk, first of all. I had two questions. The first one is that, let's say I am going to teach a class. So how do I go about making these activities or designing these activities? Like how should I approach it? That's my first question.
Okay, that's that's the kind of question I need to talk about tomorrow, because that's probably a 10 or 15 minute, at least 10-minute answer. So the really quick issue is or the simplistic quick answer, and like I say, I welcome a much deeper, longer discussion tomorrow, but is to think about the decisions you want the students to be able to make to solve what kind of problems you want them to be able to solve. And then you have to think about, okay, what's a good activity that will have them practice doing that? Now, if you've already given lectures in the subject, there's oftentimes a pretty easy way to, or relatively straightforward way to do a conversion there. And if you look at the paper that I referenced, the Jones, Madison, Wieman physical review paper, we go into quite a lot of detail in that paper on just how to make those decisions and how to design the instructional activities.
Okay. Also, my other question was, you mentioned that if you making jokes might be distracting to the teaching process, but how would one test that? And also, like from like personal experience, I remember that whenever a joke was made in class, it helped me focus better in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So is that really tested?
I'd be doubtful, to be honest, about your claim that you focus better on the material in the next 5 or 10 minutes, as opposed to still paying attention, but being more thinking about the joke than the actual.
Right. That
yeah,
that could very
so-
well be a bias.
Because this is an easy thing for cognitive psychologists to study, and they've kind of studied it to death, this working memory and stuff that goes into working memory and how it hurts the learning. But also they've studied how, and it's kind of interesting, how bad people are at recognizing this is happening, that there's something inherent in people that we all think we can multitask better than when it's actually measured than we're actually doing. So that would be my answer there. And I'm no different from everybody else in this.
Thank you.
Okay, Kyle.
Great. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. I was just curious. It seemed like a lot of the framing about the students was kind of as a single population. I'm just curious if there are useful ways to distinguish different types of learners. So I'm just thinking about things like more introverted versus extroverted students and the social aspect, or like more visual learners. Maybe that's not actually, maybe those are all myths, or maybe they're actually backed up, but could you just comment on that?
Yeah, so first the visual versus auditory and so on, that's a myth. And it's an unfortunately powerful, pervasive myth. And it's actually driven by some powerful, like many myths in our society, driven by economic interests. And so, which I could talk about for a lot, but I won't. I'll just tell you, no, it's wrong, but people are happily claiming it's right because they make money off of those claims. But there are other aspects to this, the student differences, the introverted, extroverted thing. Again, kind of getting into how you implement the instruction and the small group interaction. That's one of the things you really have to worry about, is you have to make very clear kind of norms and expectations of behavior, and so that it doesn't end up with kind of defaulting to the extroverted students talking all the time and the introverted students not saying anything and not being involved. And so, that's kind of one of these details of implementation that's really pretty essential. And then the other major differences come in terms of, well, obviously background preparation we talked about, but sort of background experiences and cultures and values and how people are motivated, their beliefs about how they can learn most effectively. And, those are clear differences, and they're clear differences that's important to be aware of and address appropriately in your instruction. And I didn't say anything about that, and that was just because of lack of time. But it's not that they aren't quite critically important in terms of being effective.
Okay, thank you very much.
Lauren, I think you're next. I have.
Hi, thank you for the talk. That was great. So when I've taken classes in the past, and probably also when I've taught them, I've noticed that a lot of the time, instructors don't know how to teach more basic level stuff because it's just been so long since they've had to learn it themselves. So I was wondering if you had any tips or like ways to sort of work around those blind spots that instructors might have.
Yeah, so you pick the term blind spot. That's actually a technical term, expert blindness or expert blind spots. And it's exactly that, of experts not recognizing how to teach things properly, but just even not recognizing things that are critically important in the learning for students, because it's, it was 30 years ago and they've so practiced, they just never even think about how to, it's really hard to tell somebody how to tie their shoes, right? Because you just can't, you don't even think about it anymore. So the main thing I can tell you is that the way all that I'm talking about here, there's this built-in multiple ways of the instructor, not just how to present things and what they're giving the students, but there are also multiple ways of how they're monitoring the student thinking, okay? And they're listening in on those conversations. They're in real time seeing students do things, okay, and talking with them. And I would argue that's really the really important aspect of that, because they'll see, and and I certainly speak from great experience on this, that a lot of times when I go into teach it, I won't know, especially if I'm not familiar with the students, I won't know the things that they're going to be having trouble with. But if I'm doing my job right, I'll learn that in the classroom, really, and in looking at what they're doing. And so it's just something that it's a deficiency that's kind of built into us as physics, instructors, but that it's one that you just have to realize, oh, I'm going to have this weakness, so I got to make sure I collect the data that I need to overcome it. And these teaching methods, it's really built into them of having that kind of monitoring of student thinking. But it's also, once you start teaching this way and you recognize all the things that students are confused about, or that are harder than you realized, or that they didn't know that you thought they knew, and you see all these things, you realize, that's one reason why people who learn to teach this way would almost never go back to lecturing, because they realize, oh my God, I'm lecturing here and it's just 80% of what I'm saying is completely being missed because I'm not able to properly target it, because I don't know what's in students' minds enough. Chun Wen, is that pronounced, if I'm pronouncing it right?
Thank you for your nice talk. I have one question in concern of your talk. I assume we are talking about the undergraduate non-major study, right?
What it's actually lots of the research, and the one thing I presented was undergraduates who are mostly not going into physics, mostly engineering. Yes. But in fact, we've done, but we have I didn't spend time showing the research on it, but we've now applied this to courses taught by physics majors up into and including graduate physics courses. So I think we can make a pretty solid claim that we know the underlying principles that apply over that full spectrum.
I have another point of view, is that before you show a picture of 300 people taking a lecture, what if we reduce the class size? Let's say we reduce the class size to 15 as a graduate level class, or even we have even smaller class size. Will it have a better education effect to students?
So, if you go, we do have quite a bit of data, and if I go back to, yeah, so these classes have anywhere, these advanced undergraduate courses, they have anywhere from 20 to 100 students in them, and there's really very little difference over that scale, and in fact, when people who are familiar with teaching this way, they'll do very much the same things and find that they're about as effective, when they're down to 3 or 4 students even. So, there's implementation details that you have to worry about that kind of come in when you're at the above 80 level, and then when you're moving between 80 and 150, but the same principles seem to work pretty well, and we've got data on the effectiveness at all those different scales.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Thanks, Carl, for the great talk. I have a question actually, but before I ask it, I think Mariam had one and was having difficulty with the raise.
Yeah, so as a host, I don't seem to have a raised hand. So I wanted to, as a good physicist, I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
So comment is, seeing that so many people are interested, it's really great to hear the interest, and thank you so much for your lecture. There are also, besides the resources you mentioned, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow, also NYU resources, and there were a few questions on inclusive teaching that I put in the chat. So if people could have a look at it if they want. So I think that's really important, because it also has shown that these suggestions you also made, they help everybody, right?
Yeah.
Everybody. So you should. The second question, the question I have is, so it was very interesting to see that when you had your, your sample and you controlled for, there were correlations first with underrepresented minorities and gender and so forth, and then you took out preparation, right? So I thought that was very interesting, because there's been shown work on stereotype threat, that if you're reminding people that historically, and it's interesting in the US, I grew up in Germany, but in the US, there's this thing about like girls can't do math. Like the Barbie says, "Ooh, math is hard." So if you remind them that they're a girl, and then they did studies on that, they perform less
Right.
well. And so SAT actually has now taken out the little question mark, or question you asked at the beginning was like, "What's your gender?" It just, because it doesn't have any impact for evaluating them, they've taken it out, and women have improved in their performance. So I was curious to hear about your thoughts on stereotype threat research.
So yeah, I mean, stereotype threat is well, pretty well established. I think there's also other corresponding social psychological effects here. I'd say one that we know is pretty important is mindset. The idea that you can learn this subject, or that no, you're in a group but that has a brain, whether it's because you're female or just because people around you think it's bad to know math, that you can't possibly learn physics. So these factors are important, and or certainly have been shown to be important. And that was kind of the reason that people were thinking that these were important in these demographics. What I can say is, for these courses and for these populations, those just don't seem to be significant factors. And and you can make arguments about why the things that might be the case. I mean, first, most of those kinds of studies of stereotype threat or mindset have been done in lower grade levels, and you can imagine that students are, first, the population is broader, and so there's a broader range of population, and there's also likely more sensitive to such social cues, when you're 15 instead of when you're 19 and you've made it into a good university. And so I don't dismiss those. I'm just saying that our data seems to say that for these populations in this context, they're probably not that important, but they certainly are important in other situations, and where the dividing line is, I don't know yet.
So, Carl, I had a question on one of your last slides. You mentioned that when students are explaining things to each other, that's one of the best contexts for them to learn, which rings a bell because I think, like a lot of other teachers and professors, I've noticed over the years that one of the best ways for me to learn something is to teach it to others. So I'm curious, does that work for students too, in the sense that if, rather than in this kind of unstructured way where they just form groups and discuss problems, if you have a student in, let's say, an advanced class, a smaller class, stand up and present their solution to a problem to the class, does that work, or is that just replicating the traditional lecture style way of doing things?
It's not entirely clear. Under some conditions, particularly if they were thinking, what really counts is you don't actually have to teach somebody else. You have to think about teaching somebody else. I mean, this is one of these fascinating studies that people do, is that they find out, you know, if you have one group that says they're going to have to think about this subject because you're going to have to teach somebody about it, and you have another group that says, we're going to test you on this subject, you need to study really hard to learn it. And then you test both those groups, the ones who were told they were going to have to teach, even though they never did teach, learn better. And so from that, I'd be pretty confident that if you told the student, oh, you're going to have to teach this explain this to the rest of the class, and, you know, and they had some time to think about it in that way, they would learn from that. It's not so obvious to me if you said, stand up and explain it, that they would have the same sort of opportunity for processing in a different way in that situation. It could be true, but I'm just not sure. But I'm sure that the preparation of thinking about how you're going to teach it, because when you dig into it, it turns out if you're thinking about how you're going to teach it to people, the brain sort of steps back and kind of thinks about the context that it fits in and how it relates to other things in a way that people don't think about nearly so much when they're just focusing on the topic. And so that's kind of critical. David.
Just a question about the generalizability of all of this. I would imagine that these methods would work pretty well in the context of teaching other science courses, chemistry, biology, and so forth, and engineering subjects, engineering courses as well. So sort of a two-part question. First, do you have experience with these sorts of methods being used, say, in engineering courses, for example? And then just to go a little bit off the deep end, how broadly can these methods be expected to work? Are they good for teaching psychology, philosophy, literature? I just wondered if you've thought about any of these broader questions too.
Yeah, so the answer is
a lot there to answer.
The first thing I'll say is this is a meta-analysis of hundreds and hundreds of studies, and what they showed was that essentially across all STEM subjects, these methods seem to work roughly equivalently as well. And all STEM subjects in all levels, at least at the undergraduate levels. And there's good reasons to understand why that works. When you go and ask about, okay, more broadly, there's much less research done. There's some done in the social sciences, economics, and it seems like it shows much the same thing. I think there's some fundamental reasons to think that they would work very generally, and I'll explain those, but people haven't tested this yet. So there's two aspects to this. One is, there are two reasons I make these generalizations, is that people have studied the acquisition or development of expertise across many different subjects. This is a cognitive psychologist who've done this. And that includes athletics, it includes music, chess, and various academic subjects. And they find that there's a very clear and process. This is Anders Ericsson's work, if you want to look it up, but I give some reference to it, of this, talk about this deliberate practice where you have to break the skill down, whatever it is, whether it's playing golf or whatever. You have to break it down into the specific sub skills, and then people intently practice thinking about those and get feedback on that practice on how to improve. And so that's sort of a very general thing they've seen, but any element of expertise, they dig into what did people have to do to learn that. And that's very consistent within the idea that, well, you need the brain to hook up the neurons and be optimized for that. So then you have to say, well, what is the thing that needs to be practiced? Can you identify what needs to be practiced in these different in these other fields? And we've seen now, I think, very clearly that these problem-solving decisions that we've identified apply in engineering and sciences, are well-defined and consistent. And so it makes good sense that when people are practicing those in some forms, they're getting better at it. But then that raises the question, okay, is there anything equivalent in other disciplines? And I think I know enough, not a lot, but enough about social sciences to be able to say, yes, look, you're in this discipline, they're consistently having to make these kind of decisions and these, to solve these problems. They're looking for deciding on evidence. They're making conclusions on the basis of evidence in these subjects in a consistent way. When you get into humanities and so on, it gets fuzzier. I get less confident, but I still think that there are very likely a consistent set of decisions that are made in a particular way that really define the discipline itself by defining what expertise means in that discipline. And so for most disciplines, I think it's very likely would be true. And if you could ever get them to collect data, which the humanists never will, but they would learn that they would see the same. I mean, I know in history, it almost certainly is pretty, I've talked to historians in detail, and they actually can define their subject and what you need to learn in very much ways like scientists do. And I think I'd be very confident that it would, the difference between a lecture on a history subject versus practicing making decisions about how to interpret, different artifacts and the credibility of them, we'd see just the same kind of things we get in physics. Marco?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for this lecture. It's really interesting. I wanted to ask about kind of like looking forward a bit. You've shown us all these results, and a lot of them are very clear, and some of them have been known for a few decades. But of course, the important part is that they get adopted. And so I was wondering what your perspective is on the kinds of commitments that the broader community needs to make to adopt them, or is this something that you think should just diffuse kind of through the community over the years?
Yeah, so this gets into a completely different area that I've actually done quite a bit of work on institutional change. And so I'll refer you, this is when I led this big effort at particularly at University of British Columbia, the Science Education Initiative, on changing, seeing if you could change how entire science departments, multiple entire science departments, how they teach and what factors were important to make that happen. And so I've written, there's a book on that I wrote, Improving How Universities Teach Science. But my conclusion from that experiment, which was working with hundreds of faculty and changing it, is that, well, first, one thing that's demonstrated, we demonstrated that it doesn't cost any more money to teach this way, and you get better learning outcomes. It does take some investment of time and therefore money for people to learn to teach this way. Not enormous, but significant. And so those are, those are two important factors in universities these days, is the money. But ultimately, I think it's all has to do with the incentive system. That in fact, I would argue on the basis of our work on institutional change that faculty are not nearly as independent as they think, and they're doing exactly what they're getting rewarded for. And right now we being higher education has really terrible ways of evaluating teaching. It's almost all based on student course evaluations. There's lots of data showing that those just, they don't reflect the student learning. They don't reflect the use of most effective practices. And so, I think what really has to happen is just institutions have to adopt, and it'll take, some political will and some non-trivial amount of effort to adopt more meaningful evaluations of teaching. And when that becomes the norm, and the reward system and the hiring and promotions based on that, and I don't mean that you throw out the standards we have now for research and so on. I just mean you have to put in a measurable, significant measurable part associated with better teaching methods. As soon as that's in place and that's the norm, then everybody's going to start doing it. And until that becomes the norm, nobody's going to start doing it, because it's just the system penalizes individuals for it. So now, I'll put in a plug for the AAU, American Association of Universities, through its STEM initiative, is actually having a competition, which I put in some support for, to demonstrate better ways, much more meaningful ways to evaluate teaching as a demonstration project. So it's a grant competition, really a reward competition for people to produce, to demonstrate that others could use, with the hope that, right now nobody has any demonstrations of how to do it better. Everybody knows they're not doing a very good job, but they're scared to leap into something new. So hopefully that'll get some demonstration projects that people can say, oh, we could do this now would be better. And then once it starts happening on any sort of scale, then it becomes a marketing tool for universities. And I think things have changed pretty quickly, but I think it really ultimately goes back to that incentive system, providing incentive to teach this way before you're going to get substantial change.
Thank you.
That was just wonderful. Not a surprise, but still mind-opening. This is probably a good place to turn it off for now, and there was a momentarily no hands, and we so appreciate it. So as we've said, there's going to be a continuation, more in-depth, more informal. People who are in the department can come over to room 940 tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and people can join by Zoom. I don't know, maybe Matt, do you know if it's the same Zoom link? Laurel, I sent it out, so
So it hasn't been sent to me yet.
Oh,
so that's
okay. I thought she sent it too, but okay, we'll make sure you get that. That's pretty important.
Well,
And
then it's just, if I can interrupt just a moment, I mean, what I expected to do there was I'm not going to have anything formal to present.
Right.
This is an opportunity for people who, have some question about, okay, how do I design something? How do I, pick this? And I can, I know a lot about these things, but if you don't have anything to ask me, I won't have anything to say. It's the upshot.
wonderful. I was going to suggest that people, while it's fresh in your mind, email topics you would like to go into, and then I'll gather them together and I can send them to Carl. And there's going to be a group of people who will be there to help sort of facilitate the discussion, and people can chew them over and think of other things. I have a lot of questions myself, but I've been holding them back. Anyway, thank you immensely. I guess we can do a little round of clapping at our videos, and we'll see you tomorrow at 1 our time, 10 your time.
Okay.
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 Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye now.